In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the SASS language. This will be a brief introduction to the language. SASS is something that deserves a course of its own. I encourage you to look at other courses or tutorials if you wish to learn more about SASS. We've prepared Webpack to handle SASS code, but we really didn't get the chance to see the syntax features of SASS. Inside the style sheet, we changed the color of the h1 tag. It's not very interesting. Let's add SASS into the mix. SASS is built on top of CSS. It gives us the ability to create variables, mix-ins, functions, loops, arrays, perform mathematical equations, and nest our code. It also makes managing code easier since we don't have to put everything in one file. Let's start from the top. SASS supports variables. We can use variables to store colors, sizes, and other valid CSS properties. Color themes are common for apps. In some cases, we may find ourselves using the same color for multiple elements. If we have to change a color, it would be convenient to replace all uses of that color. With regular CSS, we would have to manually search the style sheet for all applications of that color and update it. Combing through your code is not ideal. With SASS, we can create variables that can store the color. Variables in SASS work in a similar fashion to JavaScript variables. They can hold strings, arrays, numeric values, etc. We can even assign colors to variables. Let's create a variable that will hold the color red. We'll create a variable called red. To make things a bit more interesting, we'll use a custom color of red. The value will be $CC3244. Variable definitions must start with a $sign symbol. Afterward, we can set a name. To assign a value, we must use a colon followed by the value itself. In this instance, we're setting the variable red to a hex color value. All CSS color codes are supported. This includes RGB, HSV, RGBA, etc. I prefer to use hex code. Let's use the variable. Inside the h1 selector, rather than setting the color to red, we'll set it to the variable red. SASS will process this file. It'll replace the variable red with the hex code. Let's test if this is true. Before we run the command, let's make one small adjustment to Webpack. We're continually typing the same command whenever we update our codebase. That can be rather annoying. Webpack has a watch feature. It'll watch our files for changes. If it detects a change, it'll recompile the bundle. We need to configure Webpack to watch for changes. Inside the configuration file, add a property called watch. Its value will be set to true. The watch property will tell Webpack to watch our files for changes. By default, it's turned off. We can set it to true to turn it on. Let's run the command npm run start. If we were to scroll up inside the command line, we'll add a message that says Webpack is watching the file. We can't run any further commands, but Webpack is in a state where it will process your code again whenever a file in our project changes. With the watcher in place, let's refresh the page to see the result. After doing so, the heading is still red. We can use the developer tools to verify if the property is properly being set to the value we assigned to the variable. This output proves that SASS is working as expected. Variables are a great way to reference a single value. We won't have to search through several files to change the color. We just need to change the variable's value. This is not all that SASS can offer us. Back inside the SASS file, we're going to select the h1 tag again, but add the pseudo selector hover. Let's say we wanted to change the color of the header if a user hovers over it. It's a common behavior you may want to implement. We'll add the color property to the selector. However, we're not going to set it to a specific value. Instead, we'll use a function. We're going to make the element darker than it was previously. Typically, We may mess around with a color picker to find the right color to use. That's fine, but that can carry some inconsistencies in our design. Instead, it would be better if we could calculate that value. Well, that's entirely possible. SASS comes with a set of functions for calculating color values. We're going to assign this property to the darken function. Functions are written similarly to JavaScript functions. It's the name followed by a pair of parentheses. SASS functions have arguments similar to JavaScript functions. This function has two arguments. The first is the color to change. We'll pass in the red variable. The second argument is the percentage to darken the color. This function does as its name says. It'll return a darker color of the color we pass in. This way, we don't have to guess what color to change it. We can calculate it, which may be the preferable solution if you lean towards more programming rather than design. We'll make this 25% darker since we want the change to be noticeable. This value may be a bit too much, but it's just an example. Personally, I recommend using anywhere between 5 to 15%. Alright, let's check if this works. We don't have to rerun the command since Webpack is still watching for changes. After refreshing the page, everything works as expected. We can hover over the heading to view the effect. The color turns darker whenever we hover our mouse over it. Let's check out the value calculated that was calculated by SASS. In the developer tools, we'll inspect the element. We won't be able to see the value because the developer tools will show the properties for when the element is not being interacted with. We can simulate hovering over the element by selecting the state of the element on the right. The developer tools will show us the styles applied to the element when it's hovered over. We don't see the function, we see the result of that function. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the list of functions you can use to change colors. Admittedly, the official documentation isn't that easy to read or navigate. I encourage you to take your time with it and experiment with some of them. Alright, let's learn a few more things. One of the more interesting features about SASS is the ability to nest code. Back in the editor, inside the curly brackets, we're not limited to adding properties. We can add additional selectors. For example, let's say I wanted the color to be different if the span element is present. Traditionally, we would type this as h1 span inside the CSS file. However, with SASS, you can nest the span selector. Inside the curly brackets, we'll add the span selector and set the color property to blue. SASS will compile this selector by converting it to h1 span. Since the span selector is nested inside the h1 selector, the two will be combined into a new selector for CSS compatibility. This selector is something SASS will figure out for you if you type it out like this. This syntax may look weird at first, but there are two benefits to this. The first benefit is that the precedence in CSS becomes clearer. When your code is formatted like this, it can be easier to see which CSS properties will dominate others. The second benefit is that you won't end up repeating the same selectors since it's easier to tell where you've written them. This syntax helps greatly with organization and management. There will be some situations where you'll want to use the parent selector and modify how the children selector will affect it. A perfect example of this would be the hover example we've written earlier. We could nest this inside the selector like so. However, this won't completely work. This will result in the selector h1 hover. We don't want this. We want the same selector we had before. SASS provides a selector called the ampersand selector. Replace the h1 selector with the ampersand symbol. The ampersand symbol will represent the parent selector. SASS will replace this symbol with the parent selector. This will result in the selector being h1:hover. We'll save our changes so Webpack can update the bundle. Before we preview the changes, we should update our template to verify if the span selector works. Back inside the document, we'll wrap the text, world, with a pair of span tags. Lastly, we'll refresh the page to view the changes. The span tag content will be the color blue. We can still hover over this to change the color to a darker color. Great, there's one last thing to cover. We're looking at imports. If you've learned CSS properly, you may have learned that using the import statement isn't the most efficient way to include other CSS files. In fact, it's much faster to use the link tag in HTML. This is still true. Import statements should be rarely used. However, import statements in SASS work a bit differently. SASS bundles your CSS together. If you have import statements in your SASS code, the files will be bundled into one. Rather than having one SASS file to hold your stylings, you can safely split your code into separate files. This will optimize the way you write code. You would still benefit from the speedy performance SASS has to provide. Let's learn how to import files in SASS. Back inside the SASS file, let's move the variable declarations into a separate file. Despite moving the variables into a separate file, they will become accessible to files that import them. In that case, it would be beneficial to store variables in a single file. We're going to create a file called variables.scss. Then, we're going to move the red variable over to the variables file. The last step is to import the code from the variables file into the main file. Inside the main file, at the very top, we'll add the following: @import variables. An import can be performed by adding the @import statement. It's followed up by the name of the file we want to import. We don't have to include the SCSS extension because it'll automatically be assumed to have that extension. Let's save our changes and refresh the page. Everything works like before. Perfect. SASS allows us to outsource and organize our code into separate files. The red variable is accessible to any files that import the variables file. We're starting to run out on time here, so I'll end the overview for now. SASS is a great language. It's definitely worth learning. I encourage you to play around with it and see what you can do. A single lecture doesn't do it justice, but it should suffice for now. Before I end things, I do want to say that you don't have to be a master of SASS. We won't be using it heavily in this course, even though it comes bundled with Vue when you use the CLI. We'll be focusing mostly on Vue, but it's always good to know what SASS is and how it works.